I was 21 years old in 2019. I was staying at my parents' house for the summer and decided to camp in the forest, in their backyard since I was in possession of the chance. This was quite impetuous journey. I simply made the decision one morning to I'll pack my things and go to bed. I had done it numerous times previously, so this was not a unique camping excursion or anything. I informed my parents of my location at 4 p.m. It was heading to, and then departed to locate a place to spend the night. I strolled for a good hour before locating a space that is open. It had a respectable appearance. I received my tent arranged, tidied up, and illuminated a little campfire. It was quite comfortable, and the sun slowly it was enhanced by the setting. Just the sort of evening I had hoped for. However, it didn't actually take that long to become distracted. The sun was only around to get beyond the treetops when I heard a voice, sort of a masculine voice speaking or mumbling. It almost seemed to be echoing a little. But since it was difficult to identify the precise location of the voice, additionally, it was sufficiently dim where the tree's shadows made it extremely difficult to see much. I probably ought to have brought up these. The woods behind my folks' house were quite large and uncharted, as in there since there were no paths in this area. Running it would be necessary to be extremely accidental, and I assumed they would simply stop by, and that would put a stop to it. However, I kept hearing the voice for most likely 5 minutes was sufficient time to they didn't appear to be merely strolling and perhaps you're deliberately keeping close to me. I finally called out, merely shouting, "Tio, check whether they would answer or say hi." However, prior to me even completing my sentence, the speaker stopped. Now there was silence in the jungle. I became quite uneasy and ultimately shouting once more. No answer, no voice. I felt a little more spooked now. Outside, there are just 20 or 30 minutes remaining in the thin film of sunshine. I made the decision that I would simply switch places. There's no need to stay there and spend the entire night feeling uneasy and allow it to spoil my enjoyment. In a few minutes, I was on my way toward turning to the woods and searching for an additional residence for the evening. I wasn't as successful, however. After 15 minutes, the fading with the heat beating down on me, I chose to simply settle down where I was. In essence, simply amidst every tree. It was fortunate, however, I did so, since by the time I completed establishing camp, there was not left light. The sun has set completely, and there was no sound in the woods. However, I found it soothing to know that I'd be able to hear whether that man returned anywhere for whatever reason. I started a little campfire again. I'd light it in the warmth for some time before reaching for my snack bag and removing some materials for creating a s'mores. I received a marshmallow was pierced with a little stick on. I held it over the flames at the top. Two had no idea what it was about. Bhutan marshmallow being roasted over a camp furious, just among my favorite activities, it assisted me in diverting my attention. It created some s'mores and spent time with a fire for a considerable amount of time, many hours at most. It was quite late by I was allowing the fire to start at that time, disappearing. The light was still a little bright, but just half of what was previously. Then I heard the sound of leaves crunching behind me. It sounded to me like in the rear left corner of my campground. However, it was pitch black, and once whatever it was, I was looking over there that IT had ceased to move and I called out again. To be honest, I wasn't anticipating a lot given how it went the prior time went. However, a short while after, a man emerged from the forest and entered the illumination, yet I was surprised when he arrived, from somewhere other than where I was observing. He said, "Didn't mean to scare you," with a grin as he approached casually to sat beside the fire. He kept his hands out to the fire to warm them. He pretended to be there as if he were expected to, as if he were acquainted with me. "Well, do you need my assistance?" "I believe you're at the," I said, "wrong campsite." I couldn't tell what he was saying, I don't know, but in any case, it was an disturbing reaction to adding nothing. I had to sort of think for a few pauses to consider what to say or do. Therefore, there was an oddly tense small bit while we sat together by the fire, not talking. IT became so heated that I kind of just inquired about anything that sprang to mind, which I probably shouldn't have in hindsight. "I heard you speaking, by the way, surrounded by forests. My other campground sooner?" The man continued to gaze at the flames, but his expression clearly collapsed. Must have been someone else. He stated in a monotone that was much colder. Voice. There was something really strange about everything. Knowledge, but I was still unsure of how to obtain out of it without running the danger off difficulty. Prior to my ability to think considering it, a stick broke behind. I turned around and saw that it was from the same location on the campsite's left back side. The man wasn't alone, which made my heart sink. There was another person present. I pivoted and gazed back at the he was looking at me across the flames. To be completely honest, I can't even recall if he was grinning, furious, or something else, since all I can recall is the intensity his eyes had. A lifeless, icy expression. Immediately leaped out of my seat and ran into the trees at full speed. Heard a statement from one of the men, clearly conversing with the other in frustration, and for a brief time, I could hear footsteps coming up behind me. Booty moved farther into the forest, and into I had lost them in the darkness. Having spent my childhood in these forests as my backyard, I could still manage to traverse them and arrive at the road, returning to my parents' house after it. For me, they dialed 911. In summary, I oversaw a group of officers in the morning to the campsite. IT was all gone. I'm not sure if that either improves or worsens the situation. On the one hand, it might have indicated that they were simply to steal from me, but on the other hand, it proved beyond doubt that they had malicious intent, so they could have been making every effort. Two of them did, in fact, pursue me for a minute. IT should come as no surprise to anyone that I never returned to those forests behind my parent home. The summer was in full swing, and as an ardent camper and hiker, I'd heard regarding an old fire from one of my friends. You could rent lookouts. They were apparently retired lookouts. The second story, written by anonymous stations, typically located in the center off miles and miles away, in the middle of nowhere woodland. The one I selected was essentially the most I found, an isolated one, and it was simpler to rent, with slots available essentially during the entire summer, and in any case, I enjoyed trekking. There was only only image of it that I could locate, however. It was quite ancient and hazy. I honestly didn't know what to anticipate. I was aware that it was the lookout tower. It's old, having been constructed in the 1950s. Yet regarding the extent of the restoration, I was going in blind to it. I packed my standard trekking equipment, and at 9 a.m. the hike began. There weren't many available views. Go. At least not in the initial hours. That's simply rough, deep woodland terrain. There wasn't much of a trail at all, and no longer. It's just a really difficult journey. However, after 5 hours, I eventually received a distant view of the lookout tower resting on top of a distant hill mountain. It appeared little and wasn't one that stood on high stilts. IT appeared to be more of a cabin than anything, perhaps elevated 10 to 15 feet. Another hour of hiking was ahead, even before I arrived. The trek was absolutely worthwhile merely for the vista by itself. I thought I could see the entire planet from there. The fire watch was in poor condition, but extremely clearly old, with some patchwork in this area, and it had been done to certain areas. A 20-step or so wraparound staircase preceding the walkway that led throughout the entire viewpoint, as well as inside, was completely deserted. IT was not glitzy, but to be honest, it might have been worse. Having this opinion, I would accept it at any time. With a few there were still hours of sunlight, so I threw my luggage down, prepared some meals, and unwound on the outside ledge. The atmosphere was really silent up there. Only the breeze and birdsong. I was somewhat exhausted from the ascent, so when the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I just my bedding onto the wood and laid down on floorboards. It was just about 8, so despite the fact that I was so tired that I had trouble falling asleep as quickly as I want. I believe 30 to 40. After a few minutes, I believed I heard outside the lookout tower something. Before I even got up to have a look, there were distinct footsteps ascending the stairs. I quickly climbed out of my sleeping bag to the door, which was noticeably unlocked on it. A man arrived a little while later, across the street. He was older, so had long blonde hair, and was in her late 40s. He wasn't shocked. Somehow, when he seemed to know that I was already awake. In this place, isn't it a great place to spend a few nights? He smiled and walked over Tonerer to me. I concurred, but not quite anxious, and I said I reserved it for the following 3 evenings. I was already, however, I was a little turned off because I knew nothing else was in the vicinity, so his presence here, along with mine, was incredibly peculiar. I inquired as to whether he was camping nearby. To be honest, I was hoping to stay here tonight, he repeated, using a smile. I was unsure on how to react, Todd had, but I simply apologized in the end. You seem to have enough, though there's space in there. It's just you, right here? I hesitated for a moment before lying, stating that one of my friends was only a few minutes out, and regrettably, we couldn't allow him to remain with us here. His smile faded as he turned to face me face and remained silent for a time, then gave a nod and began toad part. He didn't turn around until he did. Tio descend the steps once more that I observed that he was missing his backpack. No equipment at all. He must have abandoned his pack, surely, somewhere close by, but I couldn't see why nobody would be thus alone, without the necessary camping equipment, even if we intend to use the fire lookout as a place to stay. That made me feel a little uneasy. I stayed up a little later, man, and simply gazed at the woodland beneath the lookouts. I did wind up feeling quite drowsy, but returned to my sleeping bag and fainted. I felt better when I woke up in the morning, then putting the first hour toward creating coffee while taking in the scenery. When they descended from the lookout, a message was affixed to the wooden bottom railing. It was merely a paper with the words "sorry" on it. It had a happy face written next to it. I thought it must have come from the man, although he must have done this if he posted it here. Return at a later time during Theus. I was asleep at night. Felt quite uneasy right away, just considering it. The fact that he even departed a note was simply strange. In spite of the odd event, I chose to take a stroll. Perhaps it was to look around for any indications of the reason the man is still alive, as evidently he did not depart at the appropriate time to have. I strolled through the woods down from the fire lookout on the hill, but there wasn't much to see. It was all the same thick forest I had climbed throughout the day before, and I didn't observe any remaining items or campsite behind. I returned to the viewpoint and had fun. The silence for the remainder of the day. I was up considerably later than the previous evening. I had this tiny hung a lantern that ran on batteries, the wall to improve my vision a bit, and I was just kind of existing, I believed. Regardless, they gazed out at the shadows outside the lookout, only having the ability to discern the outline of the mountains. I would like to state that I didn't begin receiving ready to go to sleep until almost midnight. I left at what would have been 1:00 my belongings, took out my lantern and went to the forest. After descending the stairs to before going to bed, quickly take a shower, I approached the very edge of that tree. However, upon arriving, I noticed something moved ahead of me. It was only a hint of things changing outside of the eye. Hesitated for a moment in the dim light from my lantern. Held it up farther forward after a second, even though it wasn't very helpful. There was someone. The quiet that ensued after I spoke made even more unsettling. I essentially fled. It felt like little to return to the lookout. However, it's safer inside. Windows covered each and every wall, and as I previously stated, the door didn't even possess a lock. I had a strong desire to go, but leaving now while it was still pitching darkness, and the trail almost non-existent, would most likely be worse than simply remaining in one place. The lantern was still hanging on the wall. She gazed at the woodland outside the windows. Below. It was somewhat unsettling to realize that with the light, whether there was anybody outside, I think they could see me plainly. In the glass. In the meanwhile, all I could see was gloom. The bottom of the steps was visible to me, yet that's what I was concentrating on, ensuring that no one attempted to approach. The more time I spent observing, the more this sense of discomfort started to fill me up. I had no idea what I was going to do, so I made the decision to gather mist stuff. I could at least run after that, if I needed to. As I packed my every 30 seconds, I would pause my rucksack and return to the window to gaze outside, the stairs before carrying on with the packing, stating this repeatedly till Tuvi finally packed my bag and prepared. I positioned it against the wall before returning to the window. A man was standing at the base of he stood directly at the top of the stairs. First step, gazing at it as though he were simply waiting there, and all I could see a piece of him via every railing. However, I was certain that it was the same individual from he didn't have his backpack on yesterday and appeared almost the same height. I was very scared. Why had he returned? Why had he simply standing at the bottom, not moving off the stairs? What if he chose to attend? Up once more. My head was racing from everything. Must have been observing from the window. Him for full 2 minutes prior to the man. At last, he moved. taking a few steps to back, taking a little break before continuing to walk away. However, the path he took was blocked for me along the sidewalk, thus I became blind out of him. And if he continued to enter that path toward the woodland, it was too gloomy for me to see. I was certain at the time that the man was following me, or at least keeping an eye on me, approaching too closely for convenience, particularly during the night. It might have been my intuition expressing something to me, but I thought if I stayed longer, for some reason, I waited a few minutes, fearing the worst of minutes, after which I picked up my bag and silently descended the stairs into the beneath the lookout tower. I am unable to even express how uneasy I felt while I was walking into the darkness and away from the tower woodland, being aware that there was a possibility that I couldn't believe the guy was still observing me, pursuing me into the woods. I kept my pocket for that purpose and knife out in my grasp the whole time. I spent roughly 15 minutes walking, which was when the trail began to become much less defined, requiring me to take out my lantern. I hoped I was a sufficient distance away to the man refused to be followed and the lights were visible. The following 5 hours were incredibly disturbing. However, the sun had already risen at that point, and I managed to complete the hike and get out of the forest. I believe it's challenging to totally commit to how terrible those evenings were there. I had a gut feeling that there was something negative about the guy and his plans. One item that comes to mind frequently is that I informed the man I had reserved the 3 nights in a tower, leaving no justification for his return many times to make sure I was present. It also implies that he probably believed I would bait a 3rd night there, so if I had departed early and stayed for the perhaps on the 3rd night, things took a far more unsettling turn. Jordy's story drove all the way from northern Montana en route to Alaska. I had transformed my turning an SUV into a camper and was spending traveling and camping for 2 months out of it. And those two's primary objective, the Alaska Highway, was to be driven for months. There's a reason this road was well known. Nevertheless, it passed through the western part of Canada and was incredibly barren and tough. I was aware of that in advance, so I arrived as ready as they could be for the travel. Of all things to be anxious about, however, on the one issue that had me, it was feeling a little more exposed. Since I had to travel across Canada by car, 2 was not allowed to bring any firearms. I usually had a piece tucked in my pocket, just to keep me safe beneath my seat personally in a crisis, but for this I couldn't make the trip. Anyway, I had a good first day. It takes about 8 hours of traveling. The majority of this road segment was a little not as bleak as the next section. There was just a gas station in this following section, a few hundred miles apart, so I had to pause, fill up each and every time, and pay close attention to how I drive. By dusk, I was almost prepared to collapse. I got off the next I spotted a campsite. On the road, there were occasional pauses for rest. However, there were also numerous routes that simply have vacant camping lots in the woods. It was usually those that I liked. However, because it was already late, I saw only a small portion of the property I hauled into. It appeared to be a forest all around me, with no one else in sight. So I raised my window blinds and got in, slept until dawn in the back seat. Everything appeared to be all right. I got good, slept, and didn't awaken during the evening. Prior to resuming travel, however, I wanted to get some exercise and obtain a walk-in. As soon as I stepped, I saw a trail outdoors. Therefore, I made the decision to follow. The duration was brief. However, I believe I walked for around 5 minutes before arriving at a different location, but there was something off about it that was tough and tenacious. Obviously, someone had lately visited, and it kind of seems to have departed quickly. Half of their belongings was gone, and the other half was ripped apart and flung across the website. Having spent just 30 seconds there, I went back after turning around, but I didn't not sure if anyone remained, but to follow my instincts and return to my vehicle. However, upon my return, there was currently a vehicle is parked directly next to my vehicle. It was a pickup truck that was entirely black with windows tinted. Since no one was outside of it, I figured they watched me get up from inside, steal my vehicle and climbed in with the odd campground and the unexpectedly parked truck close to me in the midst of such a need, simply departed via a remote route in the forest immediately. I didn't even need to consider regarding whether or not anything was genuinely incorrect, since leaving the answer was immediately apparent. I spent 3 or 4 hours driving nonstop, leave the campsite until I was able to pulled into the next petrol station. This gas station appeared to be quite old and had a single double-sided pump, and no one there were others present, so I exited and began the pump. And I must admit that the views were amazing outside with mountains in every way. Therefore I wasn't bothered a long wait for the sluggish gas pump to fill up the vehicle. However, after a few minutes, I noticed a truck approaching from the road. As it approached, I was nearly positive that the black truck I'd observed at the campsite. The moment they pulled, my stomach grew tight straight up to the gas station and into the opposite side of the pump. Naturally, it was logical that they would be receiving gas as you sort of had to at each location on this road, but was still quite wondering why they would have pulled into the campground and spent just a short time there, a few minutes just to depart immediately after I did you. Fortunately, I finished in 30 seconds, returning to the vehicle and leaving. I believe what contributed to everything feeling so strange was that the man I never saw and never received either emerged from the truck or revealed himself, so it simply gave everything a slightly more uncommon. In any case, I was relieved to know that with my tank full, I would be driving continuously for some time, probably placing an enormous gap between us and obtaining to simply take in the view. In addition, EDM hoping to be ahead enough to locate a campground during the day to avoid parking any place without a license, like I did the last evening. I spent a considerable amount of time driving until I observed the sun beginning to set. I located a good place to pull off. It seemed rather more obscure. The trail somewhat concealed in the underbrush, and there were no indications that anyone had been here lately, so it surely wasn't a well-liked camping spot. I had a much safer here than I was previously. I was eager to pitch my tent and enjoy a pleasant camping experience outside, as it was much more roomy than sleeping everywhere crammed into the rear of my vehicle, although something inside of me warned me against just in scenario. I just prepared food outside and alighted in the scenery till dusk, then returned to my vehicle. Hopefully, the following day would be less than the previous two, and being aware I'd choose to remain up and observe that the few videos I have on my phone downloaded. I stayed up all night for perhaps 4 hours. I was real at ease there and was, in fact, incredibly eager to get to Alaska tomorrow AM. However, at approximately 11 p.m., I heard something outside my vehicle. After only a few moments of listening, I was positive that someone was walking. The parched leaves and sticks made it extremely loud and clear. I sat up and hurriedly put my phone down to gaze outside. Yet I was struck. A man's face was pushed against it, looking in through the side window at me. He was hardly visible to me, yet there was no misunderstanding. That's what he was observing. I recoiled, losing my exhale from the sudden terror. They also retreated, vanishing into nothingness off shadows immediately outside the window. Jumped up to the front seat right away. Seeing the second man I had heard about, he ran and walked up to the automobile. Broke the rear glass as I was about to rake the front. My heart pounding made it challenging to do the easy task of taking out my keys and turning on the automobile. In addition to looking back at the actions of the men, among them was approaching my driver's window as the other was reaching through the shattered window to attempt door opening from within. In the midst of the stress, I somehow put the ignition key in and turned it on. He unlocked the back door on the right, and I floored the vehicle, and as I got out, I went by the same parked black truck off the trail, somewhat concealed in the shrubs. They had come this far after me. After about a mile of driving, I turned off at the rear door, which was still hanging open, and to contact law enforcement using I had very little mobile service. In the middle of nowhere, of course, it was a long time, and the men were most likely now gone. I never received their license plate, and the darkness made it impossible to see any details of the face. Therefore, it was low treason. In spite of the terrible event, I still ultimately arrived in Alaska and relishing the remainder of my journey following fixing the window. What the two men intended to do breaching a vehicle in the midst of the nighttime woods, aware that I was inside. It's up to conjecture. I'd rather not even consider it.